Good afternoon. On behalf of Engineers Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Thought Leaders series, Supply Chain and Project Delivery. My name is Amanda and I will be your host for today. Firstly, in keeping with our tradition, Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to their cultures and to elders, past, present and emerging. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that today's webinar is being hosted with Engineers Australia's industry partner, Oracle Construction and Engineering. Asset owners and project leaders rely on Oracle Construction and Engineering software for the visibility and control, connected supply chain and data security needed to drive performance and mitigate risk across their processes, projects and organisations. They can feel confident in their digital transformation with modern cloud solutions that grow and scale with them at every step of the journey. Enable efficiency, collaboration and change control of teams that plan, build and operate critical assets. Today we will hear from two speakers, followed by our live audience Q&A, and I encourage you to send questions through to our speakers via the YouTube chat box. I'd now like to welcome our first speaker for today, John Davies. John was appointed as the first Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Constructors Association on 1st of July 2020, after leading the Queensland Major Contractors Association for 2 years. John has over 30 years construction industry experience supporting the successful commercial delivery of projects in Australia, the Middle East, UK and Asia. John is a passionate advocate for change. He's driven by a desire to ensure that every level of the industry is sustainable, resilient to boom and bust cycles, and able to deliver the infrastructure society needs in a collaborative and efficient way. Please welcome John Davies.
Hello, my name's John Davies and I'm the CEO of the Australian Constructors Association. Governments of all levels are currently relying on the construction industry to lead the economy forward, on the basis that every dollar spent on the construction of new infrastructure has a $3 kick-on to the wider economy. But the industry being relied upon is not in great shape. Construction companies account for almost 25% of all business insolvencies in Australia. Productivity growth in the construction industry over the last 30 years lags other major industries by 25%. Only 12% of our workforce are women, and this number declines to 2 to 3% for blue-collar workers. And most shockingly of all, our workers are 6 times more likely to die from suicide than a workplace incident. If nothing is done to address these issues, we'll struggle to attract and retain enough people to undertake the record pipeline of projects ahead of us. In October, Infrastructure Australia released a report on this very issue. The report identified that major public infrastructure activity will double over the next 3 years, peaking at $52 billion in 2023. And employment in the infrastructure sector will need to grow from 183,000 people today to more than 288,000 in 2023. These people will need to be drawn from right across industry, especially as in recent times, contractors have sought to mitigate increasing exposure to risk by subcontracting works and associated risks to specialist and general works contractors. We'll not be able to solve this capacity problem as we have in the past by flying people in from overseas, as every other major jurisdiction around the world is also spending big on infrastructure, and so there'll be huge international competition for resources. We need to think differently. Importantly, if we want to solve the critical issues facing the construction industry and deliver the record pipeline of projects, we need to first understand how industry works. The prevailing view of the construction industry is one of an industry that can be neatly divided into sectors such as commercial buildings, civil infrastructure, and residential. Contractors and designers operating in these sectors are defined as being Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3, And supply chains, by definition, are viewed as simple, linear relationships. This view of the industry is outdated and unhelpful. As an example, it has been suggested by some that one way to address the looming capacity problem is to break up large projects into smaller packages of work that can be undertaken by Tier 2 and Tier 3 contractors. This assumes that there's some magical pool of resources waiting to be tapped. As anyone who's tried to get some home renovation or repair works done recently will tell you, there are currently very few tradies sat at home waiting for the phone to ring. Whilst no definition has ever been agreed, the tier system has been used to describe different sizes of contractors and designers based largely on the revenue they generate. It doesn't take into account important things like whether the revenue generates profit, how much profit is invested in training and innovation, the diversity within the business, and the resources and technical expertise that it can call upon. It's also unhelpful to look at the relationship between a contractor and its subcontractors and suppliers as a linear supply chain, where work is broken down into progressively smaller components delivered by companies that only operate in one sector, such as commercial building, housing, or civil infrastructure, or for one type of client, such as government or private. Most companies that operate in the construction industry mitigate cyclical workload risk by operating in multiple sectors and for more than one type of client. If we go back to my tradie example, it doesn't matter if you're trying to fix the roof of your house, the roof of an office, or install a roof on a new warehouse building. You'll currently struggle to find someone to do this for you. We also need to consider the influence of globalization on our industry. Most people will be familiar with the concept of globalization, the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations, brought about by cross-border trade in goods and services and technology, and flows of investment, people, and information. The construction industry has not been immune from globalization. We import timber from North America, stone from Europe, steel from China, and specialist skills from just about everywhere. Less well understood is the fact that we also import balance sheet capacity. What do I mean by this? Clients want the assurance that if construction risks are realized, the contractor will have the financial resources to be able to deal with them, or in the worst case scenario, to absorb any losses associated with them and still be able to pay subcontractors and suppliers and to complete the project. As projects get bigger, so do the risks associated with constructing them, and therefore the available capacity of a company's balance sheet required to deal with them. While some of this risk can be insured, the recent high incidence of insurance claims has increased premiums to levels uneconomic for most. The financial capacity of the Australian market to undertake larger mega projects has not kept pace with the demand, and has therefore resulted in the need to import capacity. So in summary, the construction industry is heavily interconnected. It's not easily capable of being broken down and categorized. Projects are built by many interrelated teams of people, specialist trades and suppliers that operate across sectors and can be sourced from any part of the globe. In short, the construction industry can be defined as a complex system. It is not capable of being broken down like a watch, where you can see all the parts and see what causes what. So how do you fix problems with complex systems and improve how efficiently they operate? Well, thankfully, there's an emerging area of science that is focused on just this issue. It is called complex system theory. In accordance with complex system theory, a complex system can be defined as a system of many parts without centralized control. All of these parts operate on different scales, but in some way impact on each other either directly or indirectly. This high interdependence is the opposite of the linear relationships we currently think of in a supply chain. In fact, in complex theory, they are referred to as non-linear relationships. Complex system theory explains that strong feedback loops in these non-linear systems can cause complex systems to adapt very quickly to small changes in the operating environment. We only have to look at how quickly the construction industry responded to the COVID pandemic to see that this is true. Complex systems also have a high degree of connectivity between the various parts. In fact, it's the connections that define the system, not the properties of the various parts. It's therefore not surprising that we struggle to achieve positive outcomes using traditional contracts in an environment where every action has a knock-on effect. Because a traditional contract presumes we can know everything in advance, plan for it, and allocate all the risks effectively. Risk isn't a linear concept. It is systemic. If we're delivering projects inside a complex system, we can't manage that risk by allocating it to one party. Instead, we need to focus on how the system works and adopt strategies that drive better outcomes across the system. Collaborative contract models provide a better structure in which to respond to a complex environment because they bring together more parts of the system. They enable better contextual joint decision-making, and they align the interests of all parties to look for and solve problems. Enterprise models take this a step further. An enterprise model brings together owners, partners, advisors, and suppliers working in more integrated and collaborative arrangements, underpinned by long-term relationships to deliver programs of work over a defined period of time. Participating organizations are incentivized to deliver better outcomes. The Melbourne Level Crossing Removal Program is effectively using a simple enterprise model to undertake the various individual removal projects. Contractors and designers have been engaged using collaborative forms of contract and are incentivized to meet targets and deliver progressively better outcomes. Project 13 takes this a step further. Developed by the Institute of Civil Engineers in the UK, the Project 13 procurement model seeks to define the key elements necessary for a successful enterprise model, including a focus on long-term system performance and future operation, developing an ecosystem of partners and suppliers with more integrated relationships, providing the opportunity for early engagement, reward based on value added to the overall outcome, not on time or volume, and risk allocation aligned with capability rather than transferred through tiers of the supply chain. This final component is particularly interesting and involves an innovative risk management model where shares in the risk pool are treated like shares in a company and allocated on the basis of a party's ability to influence outcomes, with stakeholders positively incentivized to deliver improved outcomes. Here in Australia, Project 13 has been adopted by Sydney Water, and the model is being looked at with interest by other delivery agencies. Given the high degree of complexity in complex systems, it stands to reason that performance of the system is dependent on the strength of these connections and how things like work, goods, information, and money flow through the system. By separating design from construction and breaking projects down into hundreds of subcontracts, we impede the flow of knowledge from suppliers to the front end of the project, where value is created, adding costs and uncertainty at every stage of the way. This is why a focus on flow is one of the key principles of lean construction. Lean construction is a relationship-focused production management system that aims to eliminate waste from the entire construction process and deliver greater value to the clients. Lean construction also recognizes the complexity of the construction industry and therefore the need to optimize the system as a whole, as a focus on improving the performance of one part of the system could have unintended negative consequences for the other parts. In the same way as happens in the natural world, complex systems undergo a process of evolution, which is unsurprising given that the natural world is in itself a complex system. In this environment, only the fittest will survive, which may explain the adversarial nature of the construction industry and the high rate of construction company insolvencies. So is there anything that can be done to change this? We currently operate in an environment where contracts are generally awarded to the contractor with the lowest price, willing to accept the most risk. It is a short-sighted race to the bottom that is largely responsible for many of the issues that our industry currently faces, and historically has shown this focus on lowest upfront cost and risk transfer rarely delivers value to the asset owner. This is because it fails to take into account lifecycle cost, local content, or environmental impact. It doesn't incentivize increased use of social and indigenous enterprise, innovation, or improved productivity. The Construction Industry Leadership Forum, a collaboration between the ACA and the New South Wales and Victorian public sectors, is set out to improve the effectiveness and value achieved through procurement and delivery of government infrastructure programs. The forum is currently working on developing a framework that will help infrastructure clients better define and achieve value for money through the procurement process. Given the volume of construction work procured by governments, their delivery agencies are uniquely placed to act as model clients, and in the process to change the focus of the whole construction network. From one fixated on staying alive by offsetting risk and litigating to recover losses, to one focused on delivering improved value throughout the network. Another way in which government delivery agencies could make the network more sustainable is through improved packaging of projects. An increasing proportion of economic infrastructure investment is being concentrated in high-value mega projects. This is particularly true for transport investment. These projects are not only very costly, but more complex and involve substantial underground works and multiple interfaces in congested brownfield locations. All this brings substantial additional risks that are then spread throughout the construction network. Contrary to the views of some in industry, if projects were possible to be broken down into smaller components, it would not directly address capacity constraints. In fact, in the short term, it would lead to increased resource requirements in government delivery agencies. What it would do, though, is reduce risk for the construction network and allow for an increased focus on innovation and efficiency, which in turn would reduce demand for resources over time. Finally, another area where the government could drive improvement is in terms of addressing the poor culture that exists within the construction network. According to BIS Oxford Economics, in its recent report, The Cost of Doing Nothing, the construction industry's poor culture is estimated to be costing the economy over $8 billion every year. If not addressed, it could further impact on our ability to attract and retain the workers required to construct the pipeline of work ahead of us. In their report, The Great Resignation, PwC identified that the COVID pandemic has caused the population to reflect and reconsider what is important in life, and that 38% of the workforce is looking to leave their current employer in the next 12 months. They identified that after remuneration, the most important consideration for workers is improved well-being, an area in which the construction network does not have a very good track record. This is why, expanding on the important work of the Construction Industry Leadership Forum, the Australian Constructors Association has partnered with the governments of New South Wales and Victoria in the Construction Industry Culture Task Force. Guided by academic research, the Construction Industry Culture Task Force has developed a groundbreaking industry culture standard to improve industry culture by detailing measures that, if adopted, will improve time for life, well-being, diversity, and inclusion. The measures include diversity targets, adoption of flexible work hours, and implementation of well-being programs. Governments will be called upon to incorporate compliance with the culture standard into their standard procurement requirements and adopt the measures themselves. Whilst there's much that government can and must do to improve the sustainability and performance of the construction network, there's much that other parts of the network can do for themselves. And for its part, ACA is committed to working with government and industry to shift the dial and to set the industry on a more sustainable path. We identified that there are three key pillars for a sustainable construction industry, which I've already largely discussed. These are improved industry culture, equitable and aligned commercial frameworks, and sufficient capability, capacity, and skills. In 2020, we published 10 commitments to change that are aligned to these three key pillars. The commitments are increased collaboration with clients and industry partners, maximizing the social and economic benefits of construction, building a social license to operate, improving industry diversity, improving the health and well-being of our workers, building capability and capacity, reduce impact on the environment, encourage innovation and improve productivity, and strive for improved industrial relations. Recognizing the importance of the construction network, the final commitment was to improve outcomes for all project stakeholders. In releasing these commitments, the key message to all industry stakeholders is that we all have a role to play and we all need to work together. We've proven we can do this, and the work underway by the Construction Industry Leadership Forum and the Construction Industry Culture Task Force are evidence of this. But more needs to be done. So, to summarize, the construction industry has been presented with an enormous opportunity. We've been called upon to lead the nation's economic recovery. But we are faced with challenges that could seriously impact on our ability to do this. In order to address these challenges, we need to shift our thinking of how the construction industry works, from an industry made up of defined sectors, tiers, and linear supply chain, to a highly connected, complex network of suppliers, trades, designers, contractors, and clients. Capability and capacity constraints represent a real risk to the delivery of the record pipeline. But seeking to reallocate work from one undefined tier to another is not the answer. We need to take a more collaborative approach to delivering projects that focuses on improving productivity and delivering best value, not lowest cost. We need to adopt a culture standard to attract back into the industry the half the working population that currently considers it a less than desirable place to work: women. We need to improve the well-being of our workforce so that our existing workforce see the industry as an attractive place to continue their career. We need to adopt enterprise delivery models like Project 13 that incentivize the construction network to innovate and continuously improve. But these actions require joint government and industry response and leadership from federal government. We all have a part to play in achieving change, and I call on all of you to get informed and be involved. You can join the conversation by connecting with the ACA through LinkedIn and by visiting our website www.constructors.com.au. We have no time to waste. The time for action is now.
Thank you, John, for your insights. I now like to welcome our second and final speaker, Steve Brandt. Steve is an engineer with a career spanning manufacturing, production engineering, building and infrastructure, life safety, and construction and engineering technologies. He ran the Aconex Australia and New Zealand sales operation before joining the leadership team as ANZ General Manager and guiding the region through sustained growth. Contributing to global company strategy, policy and product development, Steve was responsible for sales, client service and marketing for the ANZ business unit, which was a standout region and underpinned Aconex's listing in 2014 and eventual sale to Oracle Corp in December 2017. He is a Senior Director at Oracle, where Steve has been involved in operations, sales and product support, mentoring and customer advocacy. Please welcome Steve Brandt.
Thank you for the introduction. So what I'd like to talk about today is how to create a healthy and resilient supply chain. We've got evidence to suggest that payment practices aren't getting better. The impact of efforts to improve late payment is profound. There are ways to make a difference. Payment visibility in the supply chain needs to be addressed to make that difference. And then we're going to look at standardization versus regulation and stricter penalties. I'll press right on. In 2006, a peer-reviewed academic research publication, a Journal of Information Technology and Construction, published a study that concluded that even then, when the internet was a burgeoning resource, there had been significant developments in e-commerce technologies in relation to construction supply chain management, but adoption was sporadic and slow. Enterprises continue to look at the challenge through organizational rather than a supply chain-wide view. So since 2006, the question is, have measures to improve supply chain engagement and payment practices in particular changed? Well, I'd like to share the findings from a partnership between Construction News and Oracle Construction and Engineering. We surveyed readers on the current state of getting paid, and as you can see, the responses show payment practices aren't something to be proud of as an industry. This is the overriding message from 215 respondents to the Construction News and Oracle survey, which was at the end of 2020. So despite what appear to be substantial changes from the sector's biggest companies and government in the past few years, 3/4 of the Construction News readers who answered our questions said payment practices are either the same or have actually worsened over this time. More than a third of respondents, actually 37%, gave a generally negative assessment. And these are the business and financial impacts that the respondents cited. We often hear that surprising percentages of project costs are wasted, or to put it a different way, could have been saved by more efficient processes. These impacts are profound, and you can see 3/4 of the respondents said they experienced wasted time and resources, and nearly half had their profits impacted. And in extreme cases, layoffs were necessary to sustain the balance sheet. So it's pretty obvious that if an organization suffers delayed payments, their downstream parties will know it too. But it's too simplistic to lay blame on the top of the tree. Incomplete and non-compliant payment requests are hard to consume. Keeping tabs on a project's budget is a critical process. I spent 5 years at Siemens in a contracting arm, and some of my experiences speak directly to this problem. For example, I had to chase my subcontractors to get their progress payments into us, or progress claims into us, in time. Each month, it was the same task. Where is your claim? Get it in by this date if you want us to pay you. On one occasion, I was on site. I was pressing the painting contractor to put in his claim, and he snapped off a piece of gyprock, scribbled a number on it, and handed it to me, and that was his claim. And I'm supposed to be able to process that. Another example, I asked a contractor to submit his final invoice. And I was expecting, it was a small piece of work, but I was expecting just under $3,000 for this final invoice. And it came in at $800, which I knew was wrong. But he'd obviously lost tabs on where the contract was. And the risk there is that I accept the lower number, close off the contract, and at some future time, I've got a problem because I need to now deal with a late claim of $2,000 that hits the project. And you know, maybe I've got to explain that to my boss. So, all right, the security of payments legislations across the states have helped, but they don't actually resolve these situations. So we have to accept that this is an industry-wide problem, not the fault of any one party. We asked the 2020 survey respondents to share their high-level thoughts on the key changes that would help improve payment practices. And broadly, they fell into two categories, technology and governance. Now, I'll take technology first, as that's my wheelhouse. So how do we use technology to increase productivity and reduce the risk and improve cash flow in the industry? Well, first, obviously, the impact of COVID-19 on the industry hasn't helped. It's created a tension between maintaining cash flow and rebuilding a healthy supply chain. And visibility of payments plays a key role in that. In fact, it was 43% or so of survey respondents said that improved visibility alone would help improve payment practices. But the pandemic's highlighted to the industry that cash flow is so critical to everyone in a well-functioning supply chain. Interruptions or latency of the flow of money has had major impacts throughout the supply chain. So what can be done? Well, to provide visibility, the supply chain as a whole needs live access to the details of their individual contracts, updated in real time. Obviously, the cloud makes that possible today. To avoid payment claims coming in on pieces of plasterboard, it requires a simple process for vendors to raise and fill out their claims electronically. And for this region, it needs to accommodate the RCTI process. It needs to route the payment claims to the upstream party where it needs configurable workflows to support single or multi-step review and approval flows within limits of authority based on amount or to limit the release of a retention, etc. And to be accepted, the approval processes need to be pretty sophisticated because different trades might require approval from different project teams. It needs to be able to accommodate all these things. And again, to ensure standardization, it needs to generate the necessary statutory declarations and track other compliance requirements such as insurances, safety reports, downstream payment certifications, closeout documents like warranties, commissioning documents and O&Ms, etc. All this needs to be accommodated, but it's got to be simple, easy to use. And finally, it has to be tightly integrated with the main contractor's finance system because they play that central role, and it's a critical role. And whilst with these systems, payment could be triggered through an automated clearinghouse, for many contractors, the gateway for payment is still their ERP system. And in any case, the cloud application itself shouldn't actually handle the money. So it's great that I can say that Oracle's Textura cloud application can address this now. And Oracle's out there presenting this to clients. And the good thing is it integrates with Aconex, very commonly used in the industry, where all the compliance documentation is uploaded and stored in the neutral and safe environment of Aconex. So to governance. Now, I guess the question is, would more enforcement be welcomed by the industry? By some, perhaps, because among the changes that survey respondents wanted to see to help improve payment practices was stricter penalties for late payment. Almost 76% of respondents felt that was something that would help. But the prospect of fines in an industry that operates with such small margins will probably only cause further repercussions down the supply chain. So we think the industry should look towards positive change over increased regulation and penalties, the carrot rather than the stick. So during the early stages of the pandemic, many industry sectors, including construction, found themselves either completely locked down or with skeleton staff trying to maintain business continuity. Many formerly office-based workers, now working from home, lost access to the systems and paper files, etc., that they rely on each day to run their businesses. Organizations that had moved their systems to the cloud already quickly realized the value of being always connected wherever they were. Those that hadn't struggled. So the industry can learn from these lessons and use them to inspire action on late payments. They are now getting used to working with cloud applications. They're getting used to working remotely and not right on the desk with the paper in front of them. And I think they have to make that move. They have to make that transition. Otherwise, we'll continue to see smaller businesses especially suffer. And because of that, greater scrutiny and regulation from government. our view is disrupting working practices towards the adoption of digital payment systems will bring positive change. Automating multiple stages of the contracting, billing, and payment process will have wide-ranging impact. It'll improve visibility throughout the payment cycle at all levels for everybody, free up resources to focus on other tasks, will flag compliance requirements and upcoming payment deadlines, notify operators of errors or issues in the paperwork that could stall the procedure. And all of this contributes to ensuring payment can be made on time, which is the goal for all parties. The reality is that manual error by any party shouldn't be the reason why construction payment arrives late. We should be able to deal with that at the beginning of the process, and it shouldn't happen. Anyway, I think I've made the point. One thing's clear, the industry can't continue to ignore issue of late payment. And hopefully 2022 will be the year where we finally see construction businesses embrace digital transformation of the back office rather than risk further regulation and increased penalties, which I don't think anybody really wants. Thank you.
Thank you. A huge thank you to John Davies and Steve Brandt for two fantastic presentations this afternoon. The good news is we've got plenty of time for Q&A this afternoon. Often we're running quite short of time, so it's now your turn to get involved. Our speakers are here to take your questions, so if you do have a question, you could please put it in the YouTube chat box. And a big thank you to everybody who sent through questions on registration. And we might start with one of those, and starting with you, Steve, and then John, if you'd like to jump in. But we've had a question from Rajesh in Asia. Good afternoon to you, asking, Steve, can you explain how to meet the ROS required on-site date with expedited project schedules and controlled budget constraints that don't actually give any room to play with, and without then deviating from the project specs? Steve, thank you.
Thanks. Good question, Rajesh. I don't think there's one straight answer to that, but John did talk in his presentation to the fact that the kind of the just-in-time aspect of construction hasn't really panned out that well during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we put a spotlight on that, and we found flaws in the model. And so the kind of the RRS idea, it's going to be really hard to manage that. And of course, technology is going to help. And where I would probably suggest we're going to see meaningful help in that area is technologies that track vendors' materials from the point of ordering through the manufacturing process, through the delivery process, and getting them to site on time and knowing what time that is that they're going to arrive on site. Vendors like Matrac and Wynomia, who are really using innovation, low energy Bluetooth asset tracking and things like this to be able to track materials and assemblies, sub-assemblies, not only through the manufacturer's plant as they leave the plant, through the shipping, arrival in the warehouse, delivery to site, location on site, and their commissioning status on the building itself. Ideas like this are pretty cool, so that you know where your materials are, how long they're going to take to arrive, and you're not just relying on the response from the vendors or your subcontractors to when they can get to site. And then you've got other technologies that are quite clever, like the moving guys and people like that who can give you traffic management information, so you know historically what the traffic movements are like at certain times of day in the area of your construction, and you know what kind of delays you're going to be facing getting deliveries to site. You can literally get down to the minute that stuff will arrive, you can have cranes, forklifts, and the like ready. And so I think connecting the supply chain in a way that is now placing an order and knowing much more precisely when things are going to arrive, notwithstanding disruptions to the manufacturing process through things like staff reduction and interruptions due to the pandemic, which unfortunately isn't over. And we've seen now an explosion of cases in Europe, at least in some countries in Asia as well. I think we get a lot of our products from China, and they seem to be managing it better than a lot of other places. But as we surface, as we come out, and just incidentally, Oracle's offices are all still closed in this region, so we've not returned to our offices. But as as the supply chain kind of settles back down, having more insight to where your orders are, where products are, and how long they're taking to arrive, and building your historical understanding of that will help, I'm sure.
Thanks. And John, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amanda, and Steve makes some really good points from a technology perspective. There are a lot of things out there that can assist with keeping on top of these things. But I guess the point that I come at in response to that question is in line with the presentation I gave, and the recognition that really we need to look at our industry as a complex network. It's not just a case of supplier A providing things to contractor B, who then goes and install things. It's way more complicated than that. And really, our contracts that we have, by and large, do not recognize that complexity and do not enable us to effectively deal with problems when problems arise, because things always happen. I mean, who foresaw that COVID was going to happen? We can't. We don't have a crystal ball. We can't identify each and every eventuality and document that in a contract. So what we need is the flexibility in contracts to deal with problems when they arise. And also we need more collaborative forms of contract that align the interests of all the parties to that contract towards achieving the same outcome, so that when something happens, you don't have the contractor pulling in this direction, the client pulling in that direction, the supplier pulling in a completely other opposite direction. That's when we have problems. That's the old broken model that we currently have.
Thank you, John. Back to you, Steve. We've had a question coming in from Josefa asking, are there any tools to evaluate the most suitable project delivery method for project implementation? Steve?
I'm not aware of any tools necessarily, but I would refer to the industry associations and industry bodies who are going to be the most expert in this area. For example, Engineers Australia, who will have a lot of knowledge in this area and possibly reference materials. Probably the Project Management Institute will be a good place to go to. They do offer a lot of advice in this area. Australian Constructors Association and John and his members are probably the most knowledgeable people in the country in those areas. And John has been talking about the selection of the right delivery model, the use of collaborative and enterprise delivery models. I don't want to steal your thunder, John, when if you want to add to this, but I think the best delivery model for a particular project to implement for a particular project, it does depend on the specifics of the project. But I'm not aware of any tools necessarily, or simple systems that you enter the details of the project and it suggests going this way. But I think there's expertise in the market to be gained, especially through the industry bodies.
Thanks. John, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I'd be delighted to, and thanks, Steve, for directing people in our direction. This is something that very much is an area of interest for us, and there is actually a tool that it has been developed by Dr. Adrian Bridge at QUT, Queensland University Technology, that has been adopted by internationally by a number of associations and organisations, but it still is not well known. So I'm not surprised that Steve hasn't heard of it until recently. Neither had I, to be quite frank. But it's quite an interesting tool to assist delivery agencies in identifying the most appropriate commercial model to deliver their projects, on which to use to deliver their projects. But the other point I'd probably add to this is, or an observation, I suppose, is that historically how we've decided what procurement model to use has been driven by the wrong reasons. Historically, it's been driven by market cycles. So if we see a market cycle like we're in at the moment, where there's plenty of work going around, it's deemed to be a contractor's market, if you like. And what happens, generally speaking, at times like these is clients, delivery agencies will wheel out the more collaborative forms of contract, because those forms of contract are deemed to be the ones that contractors will look at more favourably, and therefore want to bid those projects. And then on the flip side, what happens is that when the cycle turns, as inevitably these cycles do, and we end up in a part of the cycle deemed to be a client's market, then out come the more traditional risk transfer models, as they're seen to be more favourable to clients. But look, the reality is, and what thankfully we're now starting to recognise, is that that's completely the wrong approach to take, and that the delivery model should be selected based on the specifics around a particular project, not the market cycle. There will always be an instance where lump sum hard dollar is exactly the way to go, when the scope is well defined and the risks are well understood. But conversely, there'll also be a time when more collaborative forms of contract are better suited, where the risks aren't that well understood, where we have lots of interfaces, for example. And that is how we should be choosing which delivery mechanism to use to deliver a project. And that's where the tool that Dr. Aidan Bridge at QUT has developed will come in handy, as it takes into account things like this.
Thanks, John. Quick question over to you, Steve, asking what do we do to enhance and improve the invoicing process? And that's coming from Tamer in Queensland. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamer. Well, I suppose I'd ask, is it the invoicing specifically that's a problem? And we certainly would have an opinion on that. Working at Oracle is one of the largest companies in the world, providing ERP finance systems to the market. But I would say that typically especially in larger companies, the finance system isn't the best place to be running projects from. It's a good place to allocate the budget, and it's a good place to then clear payments, but it's not the place where I'd run projects from. And I guess it depends on whether you're talking about the recipient created tax invoice process or just regular invoicing, or are we talking specifically on how the claims are submitted? So I've talked to that, and we've got a very clear methodology that we believe in deeply that improves the flow from end to end. So typically an invoicing process, it starts with, is it clear what the what the order is or the contract is? Is it clear how much that invoice is being raised for, and is it clear what the scope is that's being claimed? So is it the invoice of raising of an invoice and the submission of the invoice for payment? Is it the receipt of that invoice and a clear understanding of what that is for? Is it the kind of remittance that comes back and the remittance advice and correlating a payment to which invoice it was for again which scope? So all of that, this is messy. It's messy as hell in a normal business. Finance departments are often much bigger than companies would like them to be because these things are so untidy. I remember working for a company that was struggling and they were gradually letting more and more people go, but the finance department was getting bigger and bigger as they dealt with the issues that they were trying to deal with. So our view is, in the construction industry, we're talking about engineering and construction. We need to start with a contract. The contract needs to be black and white. We need to understand how much we've been contracted to deliver for. The scope needs to be clear, and then every claim that's made against that contract, we need to update the contract amount and understand what we've got left to claim. What any changes or variations to that contract need to be captured and clear to everybody. And the problem is that every organization is running their own finance system. That naturally, they've got their own sovereign interests to concern themselves with. And you're not going to get, the builders aren't going to say to the subcontractors, for example, right, everybody use my finance system, and they don't really want to let them in there, which is why you have a staging platform. And that's what Textura is. And it's a place where the contractors, the head contractor, puts in their budget for the project and allocates contracts to the downstream, and the downstream have visibility of that contract. So they see both sides equally. And as claims are put in and the claims are approved and paid, the data is updated on both sides. And so that transparency means if there's any divergence from what's expected, inquiries can be made before it gets to the end of the project. I really don't like, there are a lot of practices that I don't like. I was caught once with a builder who doesn't exist today. It was a tier one contractor that eventually folded. That tier one contractor said to me once on a contract, and I'm sure you've all heard this, this thing needs fixing, just do it and we'll worry about it later. And I said, well, hold on, what's the cost to do this? Let's agree a price. No, just do it now and we'll sort the price out later. And when you get that kind of response, when you're told to conduct a scope with no agreement to how much is being paid or if anything is being paid, it's going to be a bun fight at the end of the project when you try to gather up these unapproved amounts. And verbal assurances mean nothing in those situations. I'm delighted to say that, right across the industry now, there's a lot less of this, sort me out on this and I'll see you right on the next project. That kind of stuff just isn't happening anywhere near as much as it used to. Certainly not in the tier one, tier two space. I guess when you get down to smaller projects, that kind of thing still happens. Agreements based on trust, side agreements, as Oracle would put them. They're not in the paperwork, very dangerous. We don't agree with it at all. And we think that all of these things should be captured through the mobile device in the application. That means that you can now do these things in front of somebody on site, agree an amount, get something down on the application, and it's captured black and white. And so I think we make the world a worse place in terms of the invoicing process, all for ourselves, being unclear. What you've got to think about is there's somebody at the end of the line here who's got to process or approve this, who has no idea what I'm doing today or what this job involves. And so it's got to be totally clear to them what changes are happening. So what we believe should happen is that the contract gets out of the ERP into a platform that's designed for delivering projects, a cost management platform designed for delivering projects. And that is Aconex project controls application does it beautifully. And then the payment side, the payment claims and invoicing and actual payment initiation all happens in Textura. And I'm sorry I'm mentioning brands, of course I have to, but this technology exists and it can do it today. And so just getting on board and using these tools takes a lot of doubt out of the process.
Thanks. Thank you for that. Thank you for that great explanation and answer. We've had a fabulous question come in from Philip in Queensland, and I might stay with you, Steve. Philip is asking you, can a supplier's database, which is updated live from their manufacturing and stock holding, communicate to a contractor's database for on-site requirements with an algorithm to select an outcome in real time? Each customer will be ranked in importance. For a supplier with numerous clients, is this practical? For a contractor, is this desirable without human interface? Thank you, Philip. Steve.
Wow, Philip, that's a really big question. And, you've got a spark of an idea here, which, could prove to be impactful innovation. It could get out there and you could change the world, which is interesting. It's an e-commerce question, really, what you're suggesting there. It's an e-commerce idea. And believe it or not, if you know Aconex, you'd call Aconex a project management platform, project delivery platform, a collaboration environment, a common data environment, etc. But it started out, the seed of the idea was an e-commerce concept, very similar to what you're suggesting there, Philip. So you're not crazy. That's a start. But yeah, there are several questions here. First of all, what we learned at Aconex, and I've learned since about technology, there's a few things I'd say. First, find a problem and focus on it. And I think you're trying to do that, although you've got several components to what you're suggesting there. Know your market and make sure it's big enough to make the investment worthwhile. And then it's got to be simple enough for broad enough audience to use it, because technology without adoption is pretty useless. And it's like throwing a party and nobody comes. So you've got to keep your idea relatively simple. In other words, try not to boil the ocean. It's a classic expression in technology, but if you try and boil the ocean, you end up never finishing the product and getting it out to market. And that's one of the challenges with technology, because it can, you think it should, and away you go. So the idea of one supplier's database being connected to a contractor's database isn't a bad idea in itself, although I'm not sure that too many contractors have a database of their requirements for their usual materials that they order and products that they procure for their projects, be it a contractor or subcontractor. Them connecting to another database so they know what that vendor has in stock and what that vendor is producing and what's going to become available, it could be useful. But for it to make a difference, I think you'd need multiple vendors plugging into multiple contractors' databases so that you've now got an industry platform that you're building, and that makes more sense. And then you've got the challenge of getting multiple contractors and multiple vendors to sign up to this concept, this platform that you'd be building, to make it big enough base of customers to support the development of that technology in the long haul. So probably the nearest example I can think of something like that is the NBS with their Uniclass based Chorus platform, which provides detail on many of the products that are used in development projects for the designers and specifiers, so that when they're drawing up their models, they can plug in a table and a chair and a chiller, etc., and the details there, rich detail. But then extending that out to the supply chain and having a database so that you can see what stock is available and how long certain items will take the lead time, and then making decisions autonomously. I mean, artificial intelligence is here. It's being built into many of the applications that I'm talking to during my engagement with the technology ecosystem in construction. Larry Ellison has said he wants Oracle's artificial intelligence capability built into every one of his applications, and he's looking for all of us to report where we're embracing it and how we're adding value to our products through embracing it. So artificial intelligence can make decisions, and it can learn through machine learning and improve those decisions. So the idea of algorithms that say, if this isn't available, order that, or if this is more expensive today, order this one. But then you've got specifications that say this is what's specified. So just automatically replacing something with equivalent. This is one of the problems with the industry, right? You order something that's of a certain quality and something else may meet the code, but it's not equivalent and shouldn't just be replaced just because it meets the code. So I can't see this happening without human intervention. Oils ain't oils, as the expression goes. Quality varies widely across the industry, and goodness knows we're seeing that now. You look at the work that's doing to highlight poor quality materials being used in construction. So I think we need to focus on sticking with the spec once it's drawn up. So look, my response to that is it's not a crazy idea, but it's a monumental concept to build and get out from the ground up, and quite a challenge to you'd probably need a fair bit of money behind you to get something like that built.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you for that. And in both your presentations, you talked about the impact of the pandemic on the supply chain. We have had a few questions like this, but I might direct this one to you, John. It's coming from Tech Chow in Asia, asking you, the recent global supply chain disruption proved a lot of problems in the existing practice. How should we go in the future? John?
Well, the COVID has taught us quite a few things, I suppose. Just the fragility of that supply chain is an issue. And in the presentation that I gave, I talked about the globalization of the construction industry and how reliant we are on importing not just materials but skills. I mean, currently we have a real skill shortage here in Australia, and we're talking about opening up skilled migration. But are we going to find all the people that we need? Because another thing about COVID has been from an expat perspective or a skilled migrant perspective, we've always operated on the sort of unwritten assumption or unwritten guarantee that come to Australia and come and work in Australia, and you can always go home and see your family if there's an issue with your family at any time. Well, that assumption now no longer holds true, and I think that is going to impact on our ability now to attract in the skills that we're going to need going forward. And also the fact that every other major jurisdiction around the world now is doing exactly the same thing we are and spending big on infrastructure. So one of the things that I think is going to come out of this, and something that very much we as an ACA are going to be advocating for, is a real focus on improving industry productivity, trying to do more with less. So we have these shortages, we have these supply chain problems. How can we get more efficient at what we do? And as everyone knows, the construction industry, from a productivity standpoint, is starting from an extremely low base. If we look at productivity growth over the last 30 years and we compare construction with other major industries, there's a 25% gap in productivity growth. What does that mean in reality? Let's put some context to that. Well, here in Australia, if we could just half that gap in productivity growth, we could construct an extra $15 billion worth of work every single year. A bit more context, what does that look like? That's one inland rail project every year. That's almost 3 Western Sydney airports extra every single year. And that's what we've got to be looking at. And we've got to look at, and how do we achieve that? Technology absolutely is a part of that. And just to pick up on Steve's point from before, and that great question that Steve was answering before, one of the real impediments to achieving what the questioner was sort of suggesting there is not so much the technology, or however big a problem that is, as Steve said. One of the biggest problems that we have as an industry in terms of adopting technologies that will help us become more productive is that at their heart, a lot of these technologies, digital technologies, rely on open and transparent sharing of information. But the contracts that we utilize to deliver our projects drive exactly the opposite behaviors. They drive the behaviors of holding on to information because I might be able to use that as a claim against you, or I might be able to defend a claim from you if I hold on to that information. Until we address that fundamental problem, we will struggle to see and take advantage of all of those digital technologies that are out there, all of the good stuff that is out there, like the packages that Steve has spoken to, that Oracle produce as an example. If we look at digital engineering, if we look at BIM as an example, BIM digital engineering has been in existence for 30 years. Let's just stop and think about that for a second. 30 years BIM has been around, and yet we still get excited when we see a 3D model on a computer screen, which is BIM level 0.5 on a scale of 1 to 10. Reason being, why have we only got to that stage? It's that open and transparent sharing of information. Until we change that fundamental platform of openness and encourage that sharing of information, we're really going to struggle to go forward. But we need to make that change now. We do not have the resources that we need to deliver this huge pipeline of work ahead of us. We've got to get more efficient, and digital technologies are absolutely part of that solution.
Thanks, John. Thank you for that. We've got an interesting question here, and staying with you, John, and it's around that a survey on connectivity and digital technology in the construction sector has recently been conducted by the Australian Broadband Advisory Council's Construction Expert Working Group. Given today's discussion and considering what yourself and the ACA's involvement with the working group, what can we expect to see in terms of recommendations to further support the adoption and use of digital technologies within the industry? Thanks, John.
Well, thanks for that question, whoever that question came from. That's a great plug. I actually sit on that advisory board, and it's a really interesting conversation that's being had, and an important conversation that's being had for the reasons I've just given. We need to advance and use more digital technologies. And the real interesting thing about that advisory group is that it covers the length and breadth of the industry. It includes technology providers, and it also includes stakeholders that are involved in many different parts of the sector. So people involved in house building, for example. And whilst I talk a lot about I guess the bigger end of the industry, because that's where my members operate, there is a huge opportunity for adoption of digital technologies across the sector, all the way from small house builders up to big contractors focused on big civil infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, that type of thing. And there's a number of things that working group is looking at, from the contractual issues that I just sort of talked to, but also looking at just simple awareness. There's a huge problem with awareness of just what is out there and just what is possible. And there's also an issue around, I guess, education and to how to use some of those tools. And also that there needs to be some way of bringing some of these things together and integrating some of these things. I mean, one of the members, I hope he doesn't mind me calling me out, Duncan Bryce, who works for Bunnings, heads up Bunnings Trade. He's on the advisory group and looking at, down to that level. How can we implement digital technologies that will assist everyone from almost home renos all the way through to the bigger end of the scale?
Thanks, John. Thank you for that. And moving through, and thank you for all the questions that are coming through. We've had a question from Amin asking you, Steve, does Security of Payment Act the Security of Payment Act play an active role in making clients pay on time? And do contractors actually resort to this, or is it a relationship deterrent? Thanks, Amin.
Yes, thanks. I mean, it was a relationship deterrent. I remember back in the kind of early 2000s, I'd get a bit of a warning if I suggested submitting an invoice under SOPA. But I don't think it is today, and it shouldn't be. And I think we should make it clear that this is, company policy, and this is what we do. But look, I did mention Security Payments Act and the various states' versions of it, that it's a positive thing, but it requires, what it mandates is an appraisal and either approval to pay or a payment schedule, if not approving to pay, of an invoice. It doesn't then dictate the payment timeline. And so I think that it's helped to make sure that people can't sit on invoices and say, I haven't had a look at it yet. I haven't had a chance to approve it yet. There's something funny in the spelling on this one. I really don't think I can approve it. They have to make a play on whether it's approved or not, and if not, why not, and what needs to be done to clear payment. And at that point, then you're in the hands of the contracted payment cycle, and you have to resort to all the usual routines to extract the actual payment. And so, again, transparency is the key with these things. Again, our resort to technology makes it visible, makes it transparent. You can see your claim, you can call it up, and you're looking at the same thing that the other side's looking at. And one of the things that delays that approval, that is writing your claim on the back of a piece of gyprock. Right? If you don't put in a compliant claim, then the recipient of that claim may not be able to approve it because it doesn't have all the boxes ticked. And so that then slows everything down. So the Security Payments Act puts an onus on both sides, both the claimant and the claimee. And the payee. They have to stick to the process, and sticking to the process means being compliant in the way you're making a claim. Now, many smaller subcontractors, employ, it's something like 80% of the industry in commercial class 2 buildings employ something like 8 people or less. Some very small businesses that are the rump of our construction industry, and they don't have sophisticated invoicing systems, finance systems, etc. And so submitting a compliant claim is often a very diligent process over a Microsoft Word document, making sure they've put things in the right place and still making small mistakes. And so the technology that we go to market with takes all of that doubt out of the process. It generates a compliant claim along with all the compliance documentation that has to go with it, the stat decks and all those things. So yes, SOPA's helped, but it doesn't make sure the payment gets through. So there's that piece that still needs to be done.
Thanks for that, Stephen. I'd just like to stay with you for the next question that's come in from Paul. Good afternoon, Paul, asking, Steve, thanks for your insights. What is your view on reverse factoring?
I almost jumped into that in the response to the last question regarding invoicing. So that's a good question. Thank you. So I think reverse factoring or supply chain finance, as is also known, has got a bad name now through some typical human behavior, I suppose. So the idea for those in the listening audience who aren't sure what we're talking about, the idea is that between a purchaser and a supplier, a finance organization sits, and that finance organization can conduct two functions. It can pay the supplier faster than the supplier might normally be paid through the normal payment process. So where a supplier raises an invoice and that invoice is paid, 45 days after the end of the month in which the invoice was submitted, which is not uncommon, the vendor, the sort of financer, sits in the center and says, how would you like to be paid in 5 days instead? And the supplier, who is often bankrolling their business to some extent using fast cash is king for smaller organizations, they might be working with credit card to keep themselves afloat. And credit card fees, interest rates could be 21%, 10 to 20% easily. And so for that finance organization to step in and say, look, we can pay you in 5 days instead of 55 days if you forego 2% of your invoice value, for example. And that looks compelling. It's a known amount. They select, yes, I'll do that, and they get paid that amount. Now, on the other side, with the purchaser of those goods, the purchaser might say, look, it's useful for me to not then have to pay the finance company the money that I would have otherwise paid the supplier. In my normal 45 to 55 days, I might like to extend that time to 90 days or 100 days before I pay the financer. So that gives me that working capital for longer and enables me to leverage that money. Now, that's not the sole justification for doing that. The trick with reverse factoring is that it's off balance sheet and it makes the financial records of that organization look extremely healthy, where they actually have a lien on that money, if you will, and it's a loan to all intents and purposes. So what's happened in some notable cases, Carillion in the UK was the most extreme case. They just pushed out their normal payment terms to their suppliers to 180 days and said, our new payment terms are 180 days, but don't panic, because you'll be able to choose to get paid early through the finance organization that steps in, and that's going to pay you before you would normally get paid. So everything's fine on your side. And then on the other side, that 180 days payment term is actually for the buyer to extend their term in which they have to repay the money. And the person who's paying for that is the supplier, because the fee that the supplier is giving up for that extended payment term to be paid early is now 3% or 3.5%. I don't know the numbers, but that's a sort of order of things. So you put in a claim for $100,000 and you get $97,000 back, and you think, well, that's the most of it. Let's just take the money and we can run the business. Now, Carillion took that to such an extreme that they were leveraged to a level that was very, very risky for the organization. And it all came home to roost in the most unfortunate way, and it hurt a lot of people and a lot of contractors. So what's my view at the end of the day of reverse factoring? It has its place, and it can have very positive, good benefits to both sides, but human nature takes over and people get greedy and they start to push the boundaries. And so it needs real discipline. And I think we need some legislation around it, unfortunately. We know that the Greensill Bank was a big player in that. An Australian made good over in the UK. And I was all for it when they were sort of advancing that business model, but you could see that people were starting to exploit it in the wrong way. So we need some handrails around it, or guardrails.
Thank you for that, Steve. And John, your presentation, you talked about culture in the sector, and we've had a great question from Theo Theo's letting us know that he works for a water utility that relies heavily on contractors construct assets for growth. Asking you, John, what can utilities like us do to facilitate an improvement in culture and well-being amongst contractors? Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Theo. Great question. What I'd ask everyone on this call to do is to pick up a pen right now and write down cultureinconstruction.com.au. There you will find a lot of information on just this subject. The Construction Industry Culture Task Force prepared the draft culture standard, as I've talked in my presentation, and everyone can go on there and provide their feedback, and I really encourage everyone to do that because it's such an important issue for our industry. I mean, there's quite a few things that can be done. From a client perspective, what the CICT will be doing will be encouraging clients to include compliance with the culture standard as part of their procurement process. Now, you don't have to take all elements of that culture standard. You may decide that there are some bits that you prefer over the others. But one of the big parts of the culture standard is all around time for life. And we all know that in our industry, over the years, we've built up into a situation where it is commonplace to work 50, 60 hours a week, 5 more days a week. And clients, especially government clients, I mean, we spend a lot of time designing a major infrastructure project, going through community consultation, taking the time out then to procure that job. Then all of a sudden there's this compressed period of time to build it. Why? Why do we need to do that? Why can't we just take that little bit extra time and allow the project to be built in more acceptable hours, in a reduced number of hours? And a lot of people say to me when I say that, I say, well, that's going to take longer. That's going to cost more money, John. The reality is, and there is shortly to be a study published on this early next year in Concord Hospital in New South Wales, that is likely to show that that's not the case. It's likely to show that actually, by working less hours, our people are far more productive. Therefore, it doesn't take longer and it doesn't cost any more money. So, in short, I guess that would be one area that I'd ask you to look at. But please, cultureinconstruction.com.au, look at all the different aspects that culture standard is proposing.
Thanks, John. And just staying with you, we've had a great question from Catherine. Catherine's asking you, John, what are your thoughts on using the enterprise model from concept through to design and implementation? And how do you see its application with standard government procurement practices? John?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, for that question. Look, an enterprise model is not going to be suitable in all cases, and it comes back to the point that both Steve and I have made before, in that really it's horses for courses. But absolutely, we've seen Sydney Water in particular adopt Project 13 to date very successfully, still pretty much early days. But what it can do is it's particularly useful where you've got programs of work, where you've maybe got lots of small packages that need to be delivered over a long period of time. Or even larger packages like the Melbourne Level Crossing Removal Program, where you can actually start to build up relationships with contractors over a period of time and incentivize them to gradually improve and target improvements in productivity and innovation across the program of works. Now, this is going to be a challenge for a lot of government departments. I think, Catherine, you mentioned traditional, procurement processes. That's the problem, that we're very much wedded to these traditional procurement processes. We need to be brave, and we need to start looking at alternative models. And really, governments can lead the way in this area, but they do need some support, because it's all well and good. I mean, we have conversations at a high level with delivery agencies and government ministers and the like, and the strong support for improved collaboration and collaborative forms of contract. And that message then goes down to those people that are tasked with going to market. And they open up, the contract cupboard and look in the contract cupboard and go, well, what have we got here? Well, we've got, just our normal contract. So we need to give them some assistance and provide them with the tools and the education in order to implement and to try these different innovative models like Project 13.
Thanks, John. Steve, do you want to add to that?
No, I think John's answered that better than I could have done. So I actually decline to add anything to that particular question.
Okay, thanks for that. That's good. Look, we've had quite a few questions that are quite technical in the application of some of the Oracle solutions, so I will cover off one from Bart, is asking, how does Oracle help with managing cost on projects, and how does it integrate into other financial systems? Thanks, Bart.
Hi, Bart. Thank you for the question. So I think we realized that when I suggested earlier you take the construction contract out of the company's ERP system and you put it into a staging project cost management platform, there needs to be connectivity for that to be workable. And so Oracle will conduct the work to integrate their textual payment management, invoicing and payment management platform into any customer's ERP system to make sure that that integration is in place. And that's something that Oracle does as part of our integration of the system. So it's a good question. I think without it, we were pushing. Clients had to look at that themselves. It usually means that everybody's trying to learn from the ground up about how to plug things into their ERP in this respect. We've done it now so many times. Most of the major ERP systems are now known to us, and we have no view of whose it is. We don't care if it's Oracle or not. We've built those integrations, and we're capable of doing that, so that then a payment claim is made, it comes in, is checked, it's approved. It then goes to the next person for approval. It could go to somebody else for approval, depending on the value of the contract or the particular contract. It could be that these works go to Jane, those works go to Joe. Eventually, based on business rules that are all able to be selected in the workflow engine, it makes its way back to the ERP system. In the US, actually, because many payments are made still by check in the US. In fact, Oracle processes hundreds of thousands of checks every month. People are still making regular payments to suppliers by check. And the e-banking that we're so used to here just is in its infancy over there. And so one of the great things that Textura enabled was connection through an automated clearinghouse. And so through that relationship, we could arrange the e-payments from the purchaser to the supplier's bank account, which they couldn't do themselves. So, but that's not a challenge here. We've all got that capability. So we fill all the rest of the part of it in and make it all work.
Thank you, Steve. And we did have extra Q&A, and we have, as always, run out of time. and we haven't got through all our questions, so a huge thank you to everyone who put through the questions. It's been such an interesting discussion this afternoon, and I'm sure we'll be following on this discussion at a future event. But it is all the time we have for today. So please join me once again in thanking John Davies and Steve Brandt for their time and insights. I'd like to also thank Engineers Australia's industry partner Oracle, Construction and Engineering, for making our webinar possible. As always, we appreciate your feedback on today's session to help us improve and plan for future sessions. So if I would like to invite you to please complete a short feedback form linked to the description box below. Thank you again for joining us for this afternoon's Thought Leaders session, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you very much and good afternoon.